The morning sun painted golden streaks across the cobblestone path outside Kensington Palace. Tourists lined the iron gates, cameras ready, hoping for a glimpse of royalty. But no one expected what was about to unfold in the next 60 seconds. Margaret Foster, 78 years old, stood near the edge of the path. Her weathered hands clutched a small bouquet of white roses. She had traveled 3 hours by train that morning, determined to pay her respects at the palace gardens where her late husband once worked as a groundskeeper 40 years ago. Her legs trembled slightly. The medication made her dizzy sometimes, but she refused to let age steal this moment from her. The flowers shook gently in her grip as she stepped forward. Moving closer to the memorial fountain, behind the palace gates, Guardsman Daniel Carter stood at attention. 26 years old, 6'2", shoulders squared in his ceremonial red tunic. He had been stationed there for 3 years. People often thought guards like him were just for show, statues in fancy uniforms. But Daniel was trained for combat, for threats, for chaos. His eyes never stopped moving, left to right, scanning faces, reading body language. It was instinct now. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. The high-pitched whir of bicycle tires spinning fast. Too fast. Coming from the service road behind the crowd, Daniel's jaw tightened. That road was restricted. No civilians allowed. His hand moved slightly toward his side. Ready? The crowd heard it too now. Heads turned. Whispers spread like ripples in water. A silver mountain bike shot around the corner, wheels barely touching the ground. The rider was young, maybe 19 or 20, wearing designer sunglasses and a dark jacket. He wasn't slowing down. His face showed no concern. Just thrilled, Daniel's training kicked in immediately. His eyes tracked the bike's path. Then his heart dropped. Margaret Foster had just stepped off the curb, moving toward the fountain. Her back was to the bike. She couldn't hear it over the crowd noise. Her hearing aids weren't strong enough. The bicycle was 15 feet away. 10 feet? The rider shouted something, but didn't brake. Margaret turned her head slowly, confused by the commotion. Before you continue watching, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories that restore your faith in humanity. Now, back to what happened next. Daniel didn't think. Thinking took too long. He broke formation, boots pounding against stone. His ceremonial uniform wasn't made for running, but he moved like lightning. The heavy bearskin hat flew from his head. His rifle stayed secured across his back. The crowd gasped. Some screamed. Cameras turned, recording everything. 5 feet. 4 feet. Daniel lunged forward, arms outstretched. His shoulder slammed into Margaret's side, just as the bicycle tire grazed. The space where she had been standing a heartbeat before. The impact sent them both tumbling onto the grass beside the path. The bicycle swerved wildly, barely missing a light post. The rider cursed, finally hitting the brakes. He skidded to a stop 20 yards away, looking back over his shoulder. Margaret lay on the soft grass, stunned. Her roses scattered around her like fallen snow. Daniel's body had twisted beneath her, taking the worst of the fall. His elbow was scraped and bleeding. His perfectly pressed uniform was stained with dirt and grass. For 3 seconds, everything was silent. Then chaos erupted. Palace security rushed forward. Tourists surrounded them, some crying, some shouting at the cyclist. Daniel sat up slowly, grimacing. He looked down at Margaret. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" His voice was steady despite the pain shooting through his arm. Margaret stared at him. Her eyes were wide, still processing what had happened. Then tears began streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You saved my life," she whispered, but the story was just beginning. Because when palace security reached the cyclist and demanded identification, the color drained from their faces. The name on his ID made everything infinitely more complicated. Asterisk. Asterisk, the security officer's radio crackled. His face went pale as he looked from the ID card to the young man on the bicycle. He stepped away, speaking in urgent whispers into his radio. Tom Parker, 19 years old, pulled off his sunglasses. His arrogance had evaporated. He looked toward where Margaret and Daniel were being helped to their feet by other officers. I didn't see her, Tom said, his voice defensive but shaking. I was just taking a shortcut. I'm allowed on that road. The security officer's expression was stone. Not at that speed. Not without clearance.
Ow.
Tom's jaw clenched. He knew he had messed up badly. Daniel helped Margaret stand. Her legs were still unsteady, but she seemed more shaken than injured. A female officer brought her a bottle of water and began checking her for injuries, while another officer examined Daniel's bleeding elbow. I'm fine, Daniel insisted, though his arm throbbed. Just check on her. Margaret refused to sit in the wheelchair they brought. I walked here on my own 2 feet, she said firmly. I'll stand on them now. Tourists had their phones out, recording everything. The footage would be uploaded within minutes. By noon, it would be everywhere. A senior palace official arrived, moving quickly across the courtyard. Commander Patricia Hughes, head of palace security, 52 years old, former military, with eyes that missed nothing. She assessed the scene in seconds. She spoke briefly with the security team, glanced at Tom Parker, then walked to Daniel and Margaret. Guardsman Carter, she said quietly. Well done. Are you injured? Nothing serious, ma'am, she turned to Margaret. Mrs. Foster, I'm Commander Hughes. I apologize for what happened. We're going to take you inside, have our medical team examine you properly. Margaret shook her head. I just want to leave my flowers. That's all I came for. Commander Hughes paused. There was something in the old woman's face. Dignity mixed with sorrow. She nodded. Of course, I'll accompany you myself. As they walked toward the fountain, Commander Hughes gestured for Daniel to join them. Behind them, Tom Parker was being led away by security, arguing quietly with the officers. Margaret knelt slowly at the fountain's edge, wincing slightly. Daniel moved to help her, but she waved him off gently. She placed the white roses carefully in the water, her fingers lingering on the petals. My husband, she said softly. George Foster. He tended these gardens for 23 years. Died last spring. Today would have been our 60th anniversary. Commander Hughes's expression softened. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He loved this place, Margaret continued. Loved the roses especially. He always said the palace gardens were the heart of something good, something worth protecting. She looked up at Daniel. Like you did. For someone you don't even know. Daniel didn't know what to say. He had been trained to protect. It was his duty. But seeing this woman, understanding what this moment meant to her, made it personal in a way training never covered. Commander Hughes helped Margaret to her feet. Come inside, please. Let us take care of you. Make sure you're truly okay. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Inside the palace medical wing, a doctor examined both Daniel and Margaret thoroughly. Daniel's elbow needed cleaning and bandaging. Margaret had bruising forming on her hip, but nothing broken. They were both incredibly lucky. While Margaret rested on a medical cot, sipping tea, Commander Hughes pulled Daniel aside. Young man on the bicycle, she said quietly. Tom Parker. He's the eldest son of Andrew Parker Bowles, Camilla's former husband. Do you understand what that means? Daniel's stomach dropped. Tom Parker was technically connected to the royal family, even if distantly. The son of the Queen Consort's first husband. This is going to become a media disaster, Commander Hughes continued. The footage is already spreading online. Royal Guard saves elderly woman from Queen's stepson. Palace insider nearly kills pensioner. You see how this will play? Daniel nodded slowly. Politics. Privilege. Headlines. I need you to be prepared, she said. You did the right thing. But now you're going to be in the spotlight. They'll interview you. Ask questions. Some people will try to twist this. Daniel glanced back at Margaret, who was talking softly with the nurse. What about her? We'll protect her as best we can. But Mrs. Foster has a choice to make. Whether she wants to speak publicly about what happened in a private office 2 floors above. Tom Parker sat across from his father, Andrew Parker Bowles, who had arrived within the hour. The older man's face was set in hard lines. Explain, Andrew said coldly. Tom shifted uncomfortably. I was just riding through. She stepped out of nowhere, You were speeding on a restricted road. You nearly killed someone. It was an accident. Andrew leaned forward. Do you understand what you've done? Not just to that woman, but to this family, to your mother. This will reflect on everyone. Tom's defiance crumbled. His hand shook slightly. I didn't mean for this to happen. Intent doesn't matter now. The damage is done. Outside the palace gates, news vans were already arriving. Reporters set up cameras. Social media exploded with outrage. The story had everything people loved to consume: royalty, danger, an elderly victim, a hero in uniform. But nobody knew yet what Margaret Foster would decide to do next, and that decision would change everything. By evening, the video had been viewed 17 million times. The footage showed everything: the bicycle racing forward, Margaret stepping into its path, Daniel's explosive sprint, the collision, the scattered roses. The comments were brutal, entitled, "Rich Kid Almost Kills an Innocent Grandmother." This is what happens when privilege meets zero consequences. That guard is a hero. That cyclist is a disgrace, sighed Margaret's small flat in Surrey. Her daughter Emma sat beside her on the worn sofa, scrolling through her phone with growing horror. They're calling it attempted manslaughter. They want him arrested. Emma's voice was tight with anger. They should arrest him. He could have killed you. Margaret stared at the cup of tea in her hands. She hadn't spoken much since returning home that afternoon. Palace officials had offered her a car service, made sure she got home safely, been nothing but kind. He was just a boy, Margaret said quietly. Emma's head snapped up. A boy? Mom, he's 19. He was speeding. He didn't even apologize properly. He was scared. I saw his face. You're defending him? Margaret was silent for a long moment. I'm not defending what he did. I'm just saying I saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. Not the kind that comes from getting in trouble. The kind that comes from realizing you almost destroyed someone's life. Emma shook her head, frustrated. The media wants a statement from you. They're offering money. Good money. You could tell them what really happened. What you felt? What I felt was a young man's hands breaking my fall. That guard, Daniel, he didn't have to do what he did. He chose to. Margaret's eyes were distant. Your father would have liked him. Same kind of courage. The next morning, Daniel reported for duty at 6 a.m. as usual. But everything had changed. Other guards patted his shoulder as he passed. His commanding officer called him into the office. The conversation was brief and professional. The message was clear. Daniel had brought positive attention to the regiment. He had acted with honor, but now he needed to be careful. Every move he made would be watched. At 9 a.m., a palace press liaison knocked on the door of the guard's common room. Guardsman Carter, the Royal Communications Office would like to speak with you. Daniel followed her through corridors he'd never walked before. Portraits of kings and queens lined the walls. History pressed down from every surface. They entered an office where two people waited. One was Commander Hughes. The other was a thin man in an expensive suit, glasses perched on his nose. Royal Press Secretary, Daniel Commander Hughes, began. This is Richard Ashford. He handles media relations for the palace. Richard shook Daniel's hand. His grip was firm, but his smile was calculated. You've become quite famous overnight. The hero guard who risked everything for a stranger. It's a good story. A needed story, frankly. Daniel didn't like where this was going. I was just doing my job, sir. Of course. And that humility is perfect. That's exactly what people want to hear. Richard opened a folder. We'd like you to do a brief interview. BBC, most likely. Nothing dramatic. Just talk about your training, your commitment to service. Show the human side of the regiment. Is that in order? Commander Hughes spoke up. It's a request, but it would help. The palace is taking heat from multiple angles right now. Your story is one of the few positive things cutting through the noise. Daniel thought about Margaret, about her husband who had worked these gardens for decades, about duty and honor and what it actually meant. What about Mrs. Foster? Has she been asked to speak? Richard's expression flickered. Mrs. Foster has declined all interview requests. Through her daughter, she stated she wants privacy, which is her right, of course. But you want me to speak anyway? You're military. You're bound by different protocols. And frankly, your voice matters. What you say could shape how this entire incident is remembered. Daniel left the meeting without committing to anything. His mind was churning. That afternoon, he did something he probably shouldn't have. He called the number Commander Hughes had given him, the one for Margaret's daughter, in case palace officials needed to coordinate anything. Emma answered on the third ring. Hello? Mrs. Emma Foster. This is Guardsman Daniel Carter. From yesterday. I hope I'm not intruding. There is a pause. The guard who saved my mother? Yes, ma'am. I wanted to check on her. Make sure she was recovering okay. I know the palace has been in touch, but I wanted to ask personally. Emma's voice softened. That's kind of you. She's sore and shaken, but she's tough. Tougher than she looks. I could tell that yesterday. She has strength. Another pause. The media is hounding us. Dozens of requests. They're offering money for her story. Significant money. Money that would help with her medical bills. Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach, but she said no. She doesn't want to be part of a circus. She doesn't want that boy destroyed, even though he nearly killed her. Emma's voice cracked slightly. I'm angry about that. I want him to face consequences. But she keeps saying something about forgiveness and second chances. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman.
Oh, she is.
Which is why this whole thing is so unfair. She shouldn't have to be the bigger person. She's the victim. Daniel closed his eyes. May I ask you something? If I was to speak to the media, would that be betraying your mother's privacy? Emma was quiet for a long moment. What would you say? The truth. That she came to honor her husband. That she was brave and dignified. That she deserves respect, not invasive questions. That what happened was an accident, but it still matters. That accountability and compassion aren't opposites. You've thought about this a lot. I have. Because I keep thinking about what your father must have been like. Working those gardens all those years. Caring for something beautiful. Making sure it endured. Daniel's voice was steady. I think that's what real service looks like. Not just protecting people from danger, but protecting the things that make life worth living. Dignity. Memory. Love. Emma was crying softly. Would you like to meet my mother? Properly, I mean. Not in a hospital room. 2 days later, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, Daniel arrived at Margaret's flat. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, a simple blue shirt. He brought flowers. White roses. Margaret opened the door herself, moving slowly but steady. Her bruises were visible, yellowing now, but her eyes were clear and kind. Come in, young man. Emma's made tea. They sat in her small living room, surrounded by photographs. George Foster smiled from every frame, young and handsome in some, gray-haired and content in others, always holding flowers or garden tools. He would have liked you, Margaret said simply. George always said the mark of a good person was what they did when no one was watching. But you were watched by hundreds of people, and you still chose the hard thing, the right thing. Daniel felt something break inside him, a wall he hadn't known he'd built. I'm glad I was there, Mrs. Foster. I'm glad I could help. Margaret reached over and patted his hand. You did more than help, dear. You reminded an old woman that the world still has heroes, not the kind in movies. The real kind, the ones who just do what needs doing. Outside, the media storm continued to rage. But inside that small flat, something simpler and truer was happening. To strangers, connected by 60 seconds of chaos, were becoming something the world needed more of. They were becoming proof that compassion could coexist with consequences. That justice didn't have to mean destruction, but the hardest test was still coming. Because Tom Parker was about to make a decision that would force everyone to choose sides. Tom Parker hadn't slept in 3 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the elderly woman stepping into his path, heard the sickening thud of the guard tackling her to safety, felt the moment his world tilted off its axis. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from friends, Former friends, really. Some offering support, most offering distance. Everyone had seen the video. Everyone had an opinion. His mother called twice. His father hadn't called at all since their meeting at the palace, which somehow felt worse. Tom sat in his apartment, curtains drawn, staring at his laptop screen. The comments section of every news article was a pit of vitriol. He had become the villain in a story the whole country was watching. But something else bothered him more than the hatred. It was the photo someone had posted. Margaret Foster, as a young woman, standing beside her husband in the palace gardens. George Foster in his work clothes, dirt on his hands, pride in his eyes. The caption said they'd been married 60 years, that he'd died 6 months ago, that she'd been trying to honor his memory. Tom's hand shook as he read it. He'd almost killed a widow on her anniversary. A woman who'd already lost everything that mattered. He made a decision then. One his father would hate. One that might cost him everything. He called his lawyer first. Then he called a journalist he trusted, someone who'd known his family for years. Finally, he sent a message to Palace Communications. I want to make a statement. Public, no lawyers present. Just me. The Palace press office tried to talk him out of it. His father certainly tried. But Tom had made up his mind. 3 days after the incident, Tom Parker stood in front of a small gathering of journalists outside his apartment building. No podium. No prepared speech. Just him, a young man who looked like he'd aged 5 years and 72 hours. My name is Tom Parker. Most of you know what I did. You've seen the video? You've read the headlines? His voice was rough, uncertain. I'm here to say that everything you've seen is true. I was riding too fast. I was on a restricted road. I wasn't paying attention, and I nearly killed Margaret Foster. Camera shutters clicked. Reporters leaned forward. I've been raised with privilege I didn't earn. I've had opportunities most people don't get. And instead of honoring that, I treated it like it made me special. Like rules were suggestions. He swallowed hard. I saw Mrs. Foster step into my path, and my first instinct was anger. Can you believe that? I was angry at her. For being in my way? Oh. Someone in the crowd murmured. Tom pressed on. Then I saw Guardsman Carter. The way he moved, no hesitation. He could have been hurt badly. He did get hurt, and he did it for a stranger. For someone he'd never met. Because that's what honor actually looks like. That's what service means. And I understood in that moment how far I'd fallen from anything resembling decency. His voice cracked. Mrs. Foster was there to honor her husband, a man who worked at the palace for 23 years, who tended gardens and asked for nothing. She'd traveled 3 hours on their anniversary to leave flowers for him. And I almost ended her life because I couldn't be bothered to slow down. Tears ran down his face now. He didn't wipe them away. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm going to face whatever legal consequences come. I've spoken with prosecutors. I'm cooperating fully. But more than that, I need Mrs. Foster to know something. He looked directly at the cameras. I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. I can't undo what I did. But I can try to become someone who would never do it again. Someone who understands that privilege is a responsibility, not a right. Someone who looks at people like you, Mrs. Foster, and sees the value, the history, the love you carry. He paused, collecting himself. Guardsman Carter showed me what a real man looks like. What courage is. I don't know if I can ever measure up to that. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying. The statement ended. Tom walked back inside without taking questions. The journalist stood in stunned silence for a moment before erupting into chaos. Shouting questions at his closed door, the video went viral immediately. The response was mixed. Some called it performative, a desperate attempt to avoid consequences. Others saw genuine remorse, the beginning of change. But the only opinion that truly mattered was Margaret Foster's. Emma called her mother as soon as she saw the statement. Ma'am, did you watch it? He apologized. Publicly. Margaret had been sitting in her garden, tending the small rosebush George had planted years ago. She'd heard about the statement, but hadn't watched it yet. Technology confused her. What did he say? Emma played it for her over speakerphone. Margaret listened in silence, her weathered hand stilling on the rose petals. When it ended, she was quiet for a long time, ma'am. That was brave, Margaret finally said. Foolish, maybe. But brave? Do you forgive him? Margaret looked at George's photo on her mantel. I don't know yet, darling. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a choice you make every day until it becomes true. She touched the photo gently. But I think your father would say, the boy deserves a chance to prove those weren't just words. That evening, Daniel saw the statement on the news. He was in the guards' quarters, polishing his boots for the next day's duty. Several other guards were watching with him. What do you think? One of them asked. Genuine or damage control? Daniel thought about it. I think he's terrified. I think he realizes what he almost did. Whether that translates into real change? He shrugged. Time will tell. But Daniel also thought about something else. About how easy it would have been for Tom Parker to hide behind lawyers and publicists, to let the palace handle everything. Instead, he'd stood alone and vulnerable in front of the world. That took a different kind of courage. Not the courage to act in a crisis, but the courage to admit you'd failed, to stand in your shame and say, I was wrong. 2 days later, Daniel received an unexpected message through official channels. Tom Parker wanted to meet with him privately. No cameras, no press. Just the two of them. Daniel's first instinct was to refuse. They had nothing to say to each other. Tom was connected to royalty, even distantly. Daniel was just a guard. Their worlds didn't overlap, but then he thought about Margaret. About second chances and what they cost. About whether punishment and redemption could exist in the same space. He agreed to meet. They met in a quiet room at the palace, ranged by Commander Hughes, who stood outside as a neutral party. Tom arrived first, looking diminished somehow, like the arrogance had been burned out of him. Leaving something raw and uncertain behind, Daniel entered in civilian clothes again. They stood awkwardly for a moment. Thank you for coming, Tom said quietly. I didn't think you would. I almost didn't. I wanted to apologize to you directly, not through statements or media. You were hurt because of me. Your career could have been affected, and you'd never even met me before that day. Daniel studied him. Looked for the entitled rich kid from the video. Found someone else instead. Someone lost? Why did you really want to meet? Daniel asked. The statement was public. This is private. What's the difference? Tom sat down heavily. Because everyone sees me as a headline now. A villain or a cautionary tale. But you saw me in that moment. Right after it happened, you saw my face, and I need to know what you saw. Because I don't know who I am anymore. It was such a naked admission that Daniel felt something shift. This wasn't about forgiveness or absolution. This was about a young man genuinely trying to understand what he'd become. Daniel sat down across from him. You want the truth? Tom nodded. I saw someone who'd never faced real consequences before. Someone who thought speed limits and rules were for other people. But I also saw someone who knew instantly that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Daniel's voice was steady. The question isn't who you were in that moment. It's who you choose to be in every moment after. How do I do that? How do I become someone different? You start by understanding that this isn't about one grand gesture. It's about small choices. Every day. Forever. Daniel leaned forward. Mrs. Foster didn't deserve what almost happened, but she's choosing grace anyway. That's her decision to make. Your decision is whether you honor that grace by actually changing, or by just saying you will. They talked for over an hour. About privilege and responsibility. About the weight of family names. About what service really meant. When they left, they weren't friends. But they understood each other a little better. Outside, Commander Hughes was waiting. How did it go? Daniel considered the question. Time will tell, ma'am. Time will tell. But the real test was still approaching. Because Margaret Foster had made a decision of her own. One that would shock everyone. The letter arrived at the palace on a Tuesday morning. Simple cream-colored envelope. neat, careful handwriting that looked like it came from another era. It was addressed to Tom Parker. Care of Royal Communications, Commander Hughes brought it to him personally, along with an escort. Tom hadn't been back to the palace since the incident. Being there made his stomach tight with shame. He opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Dear Tom," it began. Not Mr. Parker, just Tom. "I've thought a great deal about what happened, about whether anger or forgiveness serves anyone. My husband George used to say that gardens teach you patience, that you can't force growth. You can only provide the right conditions and trust something good will come. I would like to meet with you. Not for the cameras, not for statements. Just two people who shared a terrible moment and need to understand what comes after. If you're willing, my daughter Emma has agreed to arrange something quiet. I hope you'll say yes. I think we both need this." Margaret Foster. Tom read it 3 times. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. She wanted to meet him. The woman he'd nearly killed wanted to sit down and talk. He looked at Commander Hughes. "Is this real? Mrs. Foster contacted us 2 days ago. She was very clear about what she wanted, and very firm that it was her choice, not something she was being pressured into. Why would she do this?" Commander Hughes's expression softened slightly. "Perhaps you should ask her yourself." The meeting was arranged for the following Saturday. Neutral ground, a quiet community center in Surrey, closed for the afternoon. No media, no official observers. Just Margaret, Emma, Tom, and at Margaret's request, Daniel Carter. "I want both of them there," she'd told Emma. "The boy who almost ended my life, and the man who saved it. I think they need to hear what I have to say." Daniel arrived first, still uncertain why he'd been invited. He wore a simple shirt and slacks, looking more like a university student than a guardsman. When Tom arrived 20 minutes later, they nodded at each other. Still awkward, still processing their own strange connection, Emma met them at the door. She was protective, wary, but civil. "My mother is inside. She's asked that I stay out here. She wants to do this alone with you too." Daniel and Tom exchanged glances. Neither knew what to expect. They found Margaret in a small room with large windows overlooking a garden. She was standing beside a table that held a photo album, a teapot, and 3 cups. She looked smaller than Daniel remembered, more fragile, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. "Both of you. Please sit." Margaret poured tea with steady hands, even though Daniel could see the bruising still visible on her wrists from the fall. "I asked you here because I've realized something," Margaret began. "What happened to us isn't just our story anymore. It's become something bigger, something public, and I think we have a responsibility to end it properly." Tom started to speak, but Margaret held up a gentle hand. "Let me finish, dear. I've thought very carefully about what I want to say." She turned to Tom first. "You nearly killed me. That's the truth. Whether you meant to or not, your actions put my life in danger. And for a few days, I was very angry about that."
Oh.
Tom's face crumbled. "Mrs. Foster? But then I remembered something my George used to say. He said that people aren't just the worst thing they've ever done. They're also everything they choose to do after." She paused. "I saw your statement. I know many people think it was just for show, but I saw your face in that video. I've lived 78 years, Tom. I know the difference between performance and pain." Tears rolled down Tom's cheeks. He didn't try to hide them. Margaret turned to Daniel. "And you, young man, you risked your life for a stranger. You didn't know who I was? Didn't know if I was worth saving. You just acted, because that's who you are." Her voice wavered slightly. "My George was like that. He saw something that needed doing, and he did it. No questions. No hesitation. You remind me so much of him." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "I'm honored, Mrs. Foster. Do you know why I wanted you both here?" Margaret asked. "Because you represent 2 different kinds of courage. Daniel's courage is instinctive. It's the courage of action, of throwing yourself into danger without thinking about the cost." She looked at Tom. "Your courage, if you choose to develop it, will be harder, It's the courage of change, of facing every day knowing people will judge you, of proving through years of small choices that you're different than you were.
Ow.
Tom wiped his face roughly. I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Neither do I, Margaret said gently. But I know you deserve the chance to try. She opened the photo album on the table. Inside were pictures of George, young and old, working in the gardens, smiling at the camera, living a life of quiet service. My husband never made headlines, never sought recognition. He just tended his gardens and came home to me every night for 40 years. That was his legacy. Small, beautiful things done with love. She touched one of the photos. I think the world needs more of that. Less judgment. More grace. Not because people deserve it, but because grace is what helps people become who they could be.
Out.
Daniel leaned forward. Mrs. Foster, what are you saying? Margaret took a deep breath. I'm saying I forgive you, Tom. Not because what you did is okay. It's not. But because I believe people can change, and I believe that forgiveness is a gift I give myself as much as you. Carrying anger is exhausting. I'm too old and too tired to carry it anymore, Tom broke then. Fully he put his head in his hands and sobbed. Not the careful, controlled tears of the press statement. Real grief. Real shame. Real relief. Margaret reached across and touched his shoulder. Just a light touch, but it was enough. They sat like that for several minutes. Daniel felt like he was witnessing something sacred, something the cameras and commentators would never understand. Finally, Tom looked up. His face was blotchy and raw. What can I do? How can I make this right? You can't, Margaret said simply. You can't undo what happened, but you can build something new. You can take your privilege and use it for good. You can remember this feeling every time you're tempted to take shortcuts, to act like rules don't apply to you. You can become the kind of person who makes the world a little bit kinder. She turned to Daniel. And you, dear, you showed the world what real heroism looks like. Not superheroes or movie stars. Just a man doing his duty with courage and compassion. Don't let anyone diminish that. Daniel nodded, unable to speak. Margaret closed the album gently. I'm going to make one more statement to the media. My only statement, and then I'm asking everyone to let this story end. To let us all move forward. Will you both support that? They both nodded. Good. Margaret smiled for the first time. It transformed her face, made her look younger. Now, let's have our tea before it gets cold. George always hated cold tea. They stayed for another hour, talking about gardens and duty and the weight of choices. It wasn't comfortable, but it was real. And when they finally left, something had shifted. Tom walked out into the afternoon sun, blinking like he'd emerged from a cave. Emma was waiting, watching him carefully. How do you feel? Like I've been given something I don't deserve, and like I have to spend the rest of my life earning it. Emma studied him for a long moment. Don't waste it. I won't. Daniel found Commander Hughes, waiting at his car. She'd been there the whole time, a protective presence at a distance. How is she? The commander asked. Stronger than all of us, Daniel said quietly. 2 days later, Margaret Foster gave her only interview. It was brief. 5 minutes. She sat in her living room, George's photo visible over her shoulder, and spoke directly to the camera. I've been asked many times what I think should happen to Tom Parker. I'll say this once and then I'm done speaking publicly. What Tom did was wrong, dangerous, inexcusable, but I've chosen to forgive him, not because he's earned it, but because I believe people deserve the chance to become better than their worst moment. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences, but it means those consequences should serve growth, not just punishment. To the young man who saved me, Guardsman Carter, thank you. You reminded me that goodness still exists, that courage isn't always loud or celebrated. Sometimes it's just someone doing what's right because it needs doing. To my husband George, wherever you are, I kept my promise. I brought you flowers. And I found something else too. I found proof that the things you believed in, honor, service, it's compassion, they're still alive in the world. This is the last I'll speak about this publicly. I'm asking everyone to let us heal in private now. Thank you. The video was watched by millions. The response was overwhelming. Most people praised her grace. Some criticized her for being too forgiving. But Margaret didn't care about the opinions anymore. She'd said what she needed to say. She'd done what George would have wanted. And now she was ready to let it go. But the story's impact was only just beginning to unfold. 3 months later, the headlines had moved on. New scandals. New heroes. New villains. The world's attention span was short, and the story of the guard, the elderly woman, and the reckless cyclist had faded into the background noise of history. But for the 3 people at its center, everything had changed. Tom Parker stood in the palace gardens. Dirt under his fingernails, sweat on his brow. He wore simple work clothes and gloves that were starting to wear thin. Around him, professional gardeners tended the roses and hedges that George Foster had once maintained. "You missed a spot," one of them called. Gesturing to a patch of weeds near the fountain, Tom nodded, moved over, and dropped to his knees. The work was hard. His back ached. His hands were developing calluses. He loved it. After Margaret's statement, Tom had faced legal consequences, community service, a substantial fine, a suspended license for 2 years. His father had wanted to fight it. Tom had refused. "I'm accepting what I earned," he'd said. But more than that, he'd contacted the Palace Gardens administrator and asked if he could volunteer. Not for publicity, not for show, just to understand what George Foster's life had been like. To honor the man whose memory he'd almost destroyed. They'd been skeptical at first. But Tom showed up every Saturday, then twice a week, then 4 times a week. He learned about soil and pruning and the patience required to make things grow. He listened to the older gardeners' stories. He kept his head down and his mouth shut and worked. Slowly, they began to accept him, not because of his name or his connections, but because he showed up, because the work mattered to him. Margaret visited the gardens sometimes. She never announced it, just appeared quietly near the fountain with fresh white roses. Tom would see her from a distance, and they'd share a brief nod. Nothing more. Both understood that healing wasn't about grand gestures. It was about small, consistent choices. Daniel Carter was promoted. Not dramatically, he was now a senior guardsman. But Commander Hughes had recommended him for advanced training, for leadership development. She saw something in him that went beyond that one moment of courage. "You have instinct," she told him during his performance review. "But more than that, you have judgment. You understand that service isn't about following orders blindly. It's about knowing when to act and when to pause. That's rare." Daniel thought about that conversation often. He'd been offered opportunities to speak publicly, to become a face for the regiment. He'd declined them all. "That's not why I did it," he'd explained to his commanding officer. "I didn't save Mrs. Foster for recognition. I did it because it was right. Turning it into a career move feels wrong." His fellow guards respected that. The quiet ones always earned the deepest respect. But Daniel did do one thing publicly. He started a foundation in George Foster's name, small, modest. It provided support for veterans and civil servants who dedicated their lives to quiet service, gardeners, maintenance workers, administrators, the people who kept things running without seeking credit. Margaret was the first donor. Tom Parker was the second, donating a significant portion of his trust fund. The foundation's motto, chosen by Daniel, was simple: small acts, great love. On a cool afternoon in late autumn, nearly 6 months after the incident, an unusual gathering took place in the palace gardens. Margaret Foster sat on a bench near the fountain. Emma sat beside her, protective as always. Daniel stood nearby in civilian clothes, having just finished his shift. Tom knelt in the flower bed, finishing the day's work. Commander Hughes approached with someone unexpected: Andrew Parker Bowles, Tom's father. The older man looked uncomfortable. He wasn't used to gardens or dirt or gatherings without formal protocols. But he'd asked for this meeting. He approached Margaret first. "Mrs. Foster, I don't believe we've properly met. I'm Andrew Parkables, Tom's father. Margaret studied him, saw pride warring with humility in his face. I know who you are. I wanted to apologize, personally, for my son's actions. And for how I initially responded, I was more concerned with managing appearances than acknowledging harm. That was wrong. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Your son has been working very hard. I see him here often. He's learning. I wasn't sure about it at first. Thought it was performative. But I've been watching. From a distance, Andrew glanced at Tom, who had stopped working to watch this exchange nervously. He's different now. More grounded. I think perhaps almost losing everything taught him what actually matters. Emma spoke up, her voice still carrying an edge. My mother has been very gracious. More than you or your son deserved. Andrew nodded. You're absolutely right. Grace isn't deserved. It's given, and I'm grateful for it. He turned to Daniel. Guardsman Carter. I understand you've started a foundation in George Foster's honor, sir. It's small, but growing. It's like to contribute, significantly, not to buy redemption, but because it's a worthy cause. And because I think it's what my son would have wanted to do if he'd had the courage to think of it first. Andrew looked at Tom. You raised me right, son. I just forgot how to listen. Tom looked stunned. His father had never spoken to him like that before. Never acknowledged growth. It was always criticism or distance. They all sat together then, an unlikely group. Margaret told stories about George, about the roses he'd loved most, about how he'd taught her that patience was the most underestimated virtue. Daniel shared what he'd learned from that one moment of crisis. That courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about acting despite fear, about valuing others' lives as much as your own. Tom talked about humility, about learning that privilege meant responsibility, not exemption, about discovering that satisfaction came from work, not entitlement. Emma, still cautious, began to soften as she watched Tom's hands. They were genuinely calloused now, genuinely dirty. This wasn't performance. This was change. As the sun set, casting golden light across the gardens, Margaret stood slowly. Everyone moved to help her, but she waved them off. George would have loved this, she said quietly. All of you here, learning, growing, choosing to be better. She touched the fountain's edge, where she'd left roses 6 months ago. He always said gardens were proof that beautiful things could come from dirt and time and care. I think he'd say the same about people. She turned to Tom. Keep working, dear. Not because you owe me, but because you owe yourself. The person you're becoming is worth the effort. Tom's voice was thick. Thank you, Mrs. Foster, for everything. Don't thank me. Honor it by living well, by being kind, by remembering this feeling the next time you have a choice between easy and right. She turned to Daniel. And you, dear boy, keep being the kind of man who runs toward danger when others run away. The world needs people like you. People like my George. People who understand that service is its own reward. Daniel nodded, unable to speak. Margaret looked at all of them. We were strangers brought together by 60 seconds of chaos. We could have let that moment define us through anger and blame. Instead, we chose something harder. We chose growth, understanding, forgiveness. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. She picked up her bag. Emma moved to help her. I'm going home now. Back to my quiet life. But I'll carry all of you with me. You've given an old woman hope. And hope in dark times is the most precious gift of all. They watched her leave, Emma supporting her gently. When they were gone, the 3 men stood in silence for a moment. What now? Tom finally asked. Daniel considered the question. We keep going. We keep choosing to be better than we were yesterday. That's all any of us can do. Commander Hughes, who had observed everything from a distance, approached. Guardsman Carter, I have a question for you. Yes, ma'am? The foundation. George Foster's foundation. What's your ultimate goal for it? Daniel looked at the gardens. At the sunset? at Tom's dirty hands and Andrew's humbled expression, to remind people that heroism isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just showing up, doing the work, caring for things that don't shout for attention: gardens, people, memories, the quiet, essential things that make life beautiful. Commander Hughes smiled. That's a good mission. Tom returned to his work. Daniel headed home. Andrew stood in the gardens a while longer, thinking about second chances and what they cost. The story faded from the news. No dramatic endings. No perfect resolutions. Just people choosing, day after day, to be a little bit better. Months turned into years. Tom continued working in the gardens, eventually becoming a board member of the foundation. He never forgot those 60 seconds. Used them as a compass when facing difficult choices. Daniel rose through the ranks, known not for that one moment of heroism, but for consistent excellence. For judgment. For the kind of steady leadership that came from understanding what service truly meant. Margaret lived 3 more years. She spent them tending her own small garden, visiting George's memorial, and writing letters to Daniel and Tom. Letters about patience and growth and the long, slow work of becoming better. When she passed peacefully in her sleep, both men were at her funeral. They sat with Emma and her family. They shared stories. They laughed and cried. And afterward, they returned to the palace gardens together. Tom planted a new rose bush near the fountain. A white climbing rose, the kind George had loved most. Daniel helped him, getting his own hands dirty. Working beside someone who'd once been an enemy and had become something like a friend, they didn't speak much, didn't need to. The work said everything. Above them, carved into a small plaque that the palace had installed near the fountain, were simple words, in memory of George Foster, who tended these gardens with love, and Margaret Foster, who taught us that grace can transform even our darkest moments. Small acts. Great love. Tourists who passed by rarely noticed the plaque. They were too busy looking for royalty, for grand spectacles, for things that seemed important. But the people who mattered noticed. The gardeners, the guards, the quiet servants who kept the world turning through their daily invisible work. They understood what the story had always been about. Not the crisis, not the viral moment, but what came after. The choice to grow, to change, to honor the gift of second chances by living worthy of them. And in the end, that was the most powerful story of all. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Because real heroism isn't just saving someone in a moment of danger. It's choosing every single day to be someone worth saving, someone worth forgiving, someone who makes the world a little bit kinder, one small choice at a time. The roses bloomed, the gardens thrived, and 3 lives, once connected by chaos, grew into something beautiful. Just like Margaret had known they would, just like George would have wanted. Small acts. Great love forever.